Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. The show has been running for over 6 years now. However, for listeners who might be new to all this, the idea is that I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about a material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. This is a slightly different episode because I'm not going to be concentrating on a material. Instead, as people are going away for the summer and quite possibly looking for something to read, I thought I'd concentrate on a book. And it gives me huge pleasure to welcome Robin Givhan as my guest today. Robin is the Washington Post's senior critic-at-large, writing about politics, race and the arts. She won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2006 and is the author of The Battle of Versailles, the night American fashion stumbled into the spotlight and made history. Her latest book is entitled Make It Ours, Crashing the Gates of Culture with Virgil Abloh, which charts the life of the late designer from his childhood in Rockford, Illinois, to his position as artistic director at Louis Vuitton in Paris, the first black designer to serve in that role in the brand's 164-year history. It also illustrates the profound changes that occurred in the luxury fashion industry over his short but fascinating career. Robin, thank you very much for doing this. How are you?
I am good, and thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a joy. Was that introduction okay?
That was lovely. That was very gracious.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. I mean, we're going to concentrate on the book you've just written about Virgil Abloh. But in the first instance, I thought it would be interesting to know a little about you, because you didn't necessarily come from the fashion world, right? You're a journalist who fell into fashion. So how did that happen?
Well, I like to describe myself as a journalist who gets to stand in the doorway of the fashion industry and report back to the outside world. I always wanted to be a writer and went to graduate school for journalism and really became, someone covering the fashion industry. That was quite an accident. My first job out of grad school was as a generalist in a features section where everyone else was a critic. So I got a lot of the leftover assignments. And when the fashion editor at the time became a columnist, the fashion beat opened and I just really wanted a beat to call my own. So I raised my hand. I knew nothing about fashion, and so I did not get the job. But I was offered a part-time gig covering menswear, and that was how I started.
Okay. And so what is it about fashion that fascinates you? Why is it so important?
Well, I think it's one of the rare industries where you get this really interesting mix of very creative people. You get a global business. You get this industry that's essentially rooted in personal identity and belonging and connections and storytelling. You get a lot of fabulously eccentric people who are wonderful to write about. And it is, I think, one of the only industries that everyone has to participate in some way, unless they plan on going naked.
Yes, because we all wear clothes, right?
We all wear clothes.
Yeah. A significant chunk of your career has been associated with the Washington Post. It's obviously a good fit for you. Why is that? And is that where you are now, by the way? Because you're obviously in an office.
Yes, I'm in my office at the Washington Post. I mean, I've been here for a long time. I've come and gone twice. And it says something that I have come back twice. And I think what has always pulled me back is that I enjoy being able to write about an industry that can sometimes feel mysterious and cryptic for a general interest audience. I don't want to, preach to the choir, so to speak. And I also think it's just really good for an industry that can still be closed off to have an outside voice reporting on it, critiquing it, considering it, trying to make sense of it. I don't think any industry is particularly great at sort of policing itself. And not that I think I'm a fashion cop or anything, but I think it's good to have someone with a bit of an arm's length distance consider what it is that you're doing and how you're impacting the broader culture.
Yeah. Do people within the industry appreciate that, I wonder?
Not always, but I think, ultimately, yes, they do. I have said that, for every time there is a criticism that is negative or, and someone feels that, it's been unfair, I always say that, you critique things that you think are important and worth your time. And so I think a negative review is also a reflection of the degree of seriousness with which you take something.
You don't like the term fashion journalist, though, I read in an interview. What is it that you don't like about it?
Well, because I think journalism is journalism, and it doesn't change depending on the subject matter, or it shouldn't. I think you should bring the same kind of rigor and skepticism and reporting and fact-based writing to fashion that you would bring to anything else. And I also think that sometimes people want to put sort of a fashion journalist into the world of fashion. And that's not where we belong. A journalist is in the world of journalism, and there are rules. And so, yeah, that's why I always just say I'm a journalist who has covered the fashion industry.
Should we talk about your book, Make It Ours?
Let's do it.
Yeah. In the first instance, I do ask people this as a journalist myself. Do you enjoy the process of book writing? Because it is quite different from journalism, I think. It's a different kind of discipline, right?
It is. It's a very different rhythm. And that's something that took a little bit of getting used to because there's a sense of more immediate satisfaction when you're working on, a story, even if it's a longer one or one with a longer lead time. But the pleasure of writing a book is that you do get to live with the topic for quite a long time, and you get to go down rabbit holes, and sometimes they pay off and sometimes they don't. But it's a much slower, it's more savoring kind of experience.
It can be quite isolating.
Yes, I was going to say, I always joke that it's a bit like traveling through a tunnel, right? And there's always that point when you're working on a book where I say you've come too far to turn back, but you can't quite see the light at the end of it yet. And that's the moment where you sort of start rethinking your life choices. But as soon as there's a little bit of light, you start thinking, okay, yeah, this is a good decision.
Yeah. So what is it about Virgil Abloh that fascinated you? Because I think you've been quite critical of some of his collections in the past. I know that there was a collection based around Princess Diana that you were no great fan of.
No, I would say that he was interesting to me because he was confounding. He was someone who whose work I thought had highs and a lot of lows. And yet he was someone that had created this community of people around him who not only loved what he was doing, but lifted it up, amplified it, and sort of reacted to it in the first person plural. It was we. And that was a kind of connection, a kind of rapport with an audience that I hadn't seen really exist with other designers. The ones who have these sort of outsized reputations and draw a lot of attention, someone like a Karl Lagerfeld, for instance, was not someone that people talked about as a contemporary or as a friend or as a confidant or as, being part of their community. He was up on this pedestal. And Virgil managed to be both on the pedestal, but also part of the community.
Interesting. I mean, his output is, best described as eclectic, I suppose. He studied initially as an engineer. He did a master's in architecture, but then went on to, I don't know, he did DJing, writing and blogging for the Brilliance, threw a lot of parties. There was fine art, obviously, as you just alluded to, Instagramming, social media, graphics. And when he was in his stride working, he did collaborations with Nike most famously, but also IKEA. People queued around the block to go and look at or go and buy his furniture. He was much more than simply a fashion designer. Was it tricky to know which elements of his life to concentrate on?
Sure. I mean, just listening to that list of things that he did just, has me exhausted. As someone who had written and considered fashion for a long time, I knew that what I wanted to focus on was his fashion career. And I really felt like that was, despite all the other, the wide-ranging interests that he had, in many ways, I felt like fashion was the thing that sort of allowed for these other projects to exist. I wanted to think about certainly how his work as a DJ might have impacted his sense of fashion. And I think it did. But there's absolutely another book that could be written about a Virgil Abloh DJ and a Virgil Abloh collaborator, right? I mean, there was so much of that. But I was really intrigued by his fashion work, how he impacted fashion, and the way that fashion itself had started to shift so that he could succeed in the industry.
Yeah, that's something we'll definitely get onto. He's one of those characters that when I was reading the book, it did make me sit and think, what the bloody hell have I been doing with my time? Because he seemed to be constantly on the go doing something. The other thing from a journalistic point of view is that he seemed like a really decent man. This isn't a book that turns over the stone of his personal life and finds something mucky underneath, like, I don't know, Fiona McCarthy did with the artist Eric Gill, for example, in her biography. It is very much about the work and the context around his career.
Yeah. I think that, there are people who were very close to him, who were, very good friends with him, who could certainly speak to his personal life. He was married. He had 2 young children. And the thing that was sort of remarkable to me was the degree to which he was able to keep those things separate. There were a lot of people in the industry who didn't know that he was married and were very surprised to know that he had children. And part of that is because he himself said that he traveled something like well over 300 days out of the year. And, these are not just sort of puddle jumping trips. He's traveling internationally multiple times a week. And the idea that someone can do that and still maintain a family is extraordinary. And I'm sure there is a story. There is a book to be told about that. But I felt like his fashion career, that professional part of his life, was rich enough and deep enough that there was more than enough to explore.
So what were his qualities, Robin? How would you define his talent? Because you describe him in the book, I think rather intriguingly, as the ultimate non-perfectionist. What does that mean?
This was something that his friend Matthew Williams said to me, which was that Virgil never got bogged down by worrying that something wasn't quite right, wasn't perfect before he put it out there. He was always sort of moving on to the next thing, and he loved using the word practice, which is, something that he picked up from architecture. And he also loved talking about prototypes. And while he certainly would sort of use a prototype of a Nike sneaker, for instance, when he was talking to students and underscoring his desire to be transparent about the process of fashion, using those kinds of words also, I think, was very protective for him, right? Because if everything is a prototype, if everything is part of just your practice, then when criticism comes, you've kind of moved on to the next thing. You can sort of let the criticism just sort of run off your shoulders because, well, it was just a prototype. And it also freed him from that sort of stereotype of the designer, the tortured designer who is fretting about the exact placement of every button. That was not Virgil. There was no way that you could have that kind of prolific output and be obsessive about every single thing.
Yeah, so he wasn't sweating the small stuff, as modern parlance goes.
He wasn't, and that was part of my criticism of some of the collections. I felt like he should have been sweating more of the small stuff.
I mean, did you know him personally? I mean, obviously, you must have been in contact.
I met him professionally, certainly, and had the chance to. I saw and talked to him during his first round with the LVMH prize when he was a semifinalist. And that was sort of quite a big deal for him. And then later on, I had the pleasure of interviewing him again and moderating a conversation with him in front of a group of students and who were part of his scholarship that he had established. And that was particularly eye-opening for me just because you get to see someone sort of backstage, one-on-one, having a conversation, and then you get to see them in front of an audience, and then you get to see them interacting with a group of students who were clearly captivated and sort of in awe of him. So you see these three very different situations, and you see someone who is essentially the same through, in all of them, and who kept saying to the students, as they were engaged in, asking him questions, I have all the time in the world, just, bring it on, bring it on. He was not someone looking at his watch.
Which is a nice thing. I mean, you make the point, quite politely, I think, that he maybe wasn't the most original designer. Like a magpie or like a DJ, he would find things that he liked and adapt them. You talk about his 3% philosophy. What is his 3% philosophy?
The infamous 3% philosophy.
You're raising your eyebrows at this.
Yeah. Virgil would say that if you take a pre-existing object and you alter it by 3%, you've created something new. And copyright attorneys would disagree. And Virgil was definitely sued. He received cease and desist orders. And it was, I think, probably the most significant part of his working style that got under the skin of traditional designers. That this idea that you would take something and tweak it a bit and claim that you'd created something new was just anathema to designers. Certainly, every collection, every designer builds on the work of predecessors. They, take ideas that already exist and use them for inspiration. They do homages to designers' work of the past. But to say that it's something new when you've changed it barely, I think was really sort of appalling. And, Raf Simons, who Virgil really, really admired and talked about, whose work he talked about as being so influential for him, was quite blunt in saying that, he thought Virgil was a very nice guy, but that he preferred designers who were original.
And he was also quite careful with his own copyright. I mean, he had his own lawyers, right?
He had his lawyers, and, there was a fascinating story that I was able to look at that the New York Times, I believe the business section, had done. And it was really just an examination of the number of trademarks that Virgil's Off-White had applied for and had received. I mean, he had a copyright on these red zip ties that he would put on his sneakers.
The red zip tie. Yeah.
He had a copyright on, the quotation marks and for walking that he would put on a pair of boots. So he understood the importance of protecting his work, even if he didn't always give the same respect for the copyrights of other people. I mean, he was famously sued by the founder of Walkerwear, who was alerted to his use of her logo by friends who saw his work on social media with the WW logo on it and reached out to her to say, "Hey, I didn't know you were collaborating with Virgil." And she's like, "Well, I'm not collaborating. What is this?"
One of the threads that runs through the book is the notion of value, and what value we put on objects comes up repeatedly. And you've used one example up to a point, but I guess the best example is the Pyrex Vision shirts. I mean, Pyrex Vision was an early Abloh label, and they bought flannel shirts from Ralph Lauren's rugby line at a discount. So I think in the book you use the figure $35.99, then screen printed them and sold them for $550. As a critic, I'm really intrigued as to how you assess value within the industry that you write about.
Yeah, I think it's the idea of luxury has become such a blurry notion because at this point, any brand slaps the word luxury onto its advertising. And basically, that's just an excuse for them to be able to charge more money. I mean, it's not that it's better made necessarily. It's not that it's going to last longer. I mean, sometimes many things that are considered sort of luxury items, are not long lasting. I mean, they are quite delicate and fragile, and it's not something that you're going to have for years. But the thing that was fascinating to me about the Pyrex Vision project, which Virgil sort of described as an art project, was first the choice of using Ralph Lauren. I mean, the U.S. does not have a national costume by any means, but if there is any designer there's no designer, I should say, who better reflects the idea of Americana and all of its sort of glossy nostalgia as much as Ralph Lauren.
Well, that's quite interesting. Can I ask why? What is it about Ralph Lauren and America in that case?
Well, his whole sort of philosophy, his whole design philosophy is really based on this idea of the American dream. And he draws inspiration from the open West and ranches and from Wall Street and from this sort of waspy, sensibility of country houses and Ivy League institutions. And then you sort of add in the fact that he has, over many years, provided the uniforms for the U.S. Olympic teams. And he also made a huge donation to repair the flag that the Star Spangled Banner was based on. And, when it was unveiled, the restoration of it was done so in, this beautiful Smithsonian institution. And at the same time, they had a swearing in ceremony of new citizens. And, and Ralph Lauren is wrapped around all of that. So he is this sort of fashion embodiment of the American dream. And so it meant a lot to sort of take those discounted flannels. And then Virgil silk screened Pyrex and 23 on these shirts. 23, which was Michael Jordan's basketball number. Pyrex, which has this sort of complicated, nuanced street slang about drugs and rap and all of that. And then he sells it for $550, and they sell out. And to me, the audaciousness of that wasn't just in putting this crazy high price tag on it. It was basically saying that I have taken this shirt that is sort of emblematic of the American dream and Americana, and by my putting my personal mark on it, by injecting it with my imagination, I have made it that much more valuable. My presence, has made it that much more valuable. And I thought that was a really profound sort of statement to make using fashion. Now, do I think that the shirt itself was a $550 shirt that I personally would have purchased? I do not.
Your laugh speaks volumes there. I used to edit a magazine called Crafts for many years, and we talk a lot about the importance of skill on this podcast. The skill doesn't seem that important in the luxury fashion world that you write about here.
Well, one of the things that occurred to me is that the idea of craftsmanship and the connoisseurship in the way that it was considered, 20 years ago, it still exists in fashion, but it is becoming more and more of a niche part of the industry that is celebrated and appreciated by a particular audience. But it's no longer the essence of fashion. It's no longer at the center of fashion. I mean, I think you could point to brands that still, sort of lean into that, whether it's, Hermes and its Birkin, or, the world of couture that still, to some degree, is very much about those kinds of crafts. But that's not where the bulk of fashion is. That's not where the bulk of fashion consumers are.
And as a critic, does that bother you?
Well, as a critic, it gives me lots to write about and a lot of things to think about. And it's always interesting when an industry is transforming and you start to sort of have to balance competing notions in your head at the same time. The fact that it is, I think, a wonderful thing that luxury has opened up in terms of the definition, so that it is no longer defined solely by white Europeans of aristocratic descent. So I think that is great. But at the same time, I also mourn for the lack of the lessening of respect for expertise. And, my heart aches a bit for, young students in design school who are really trying to learn those techniques and those crafts that make clothing special and can make it beautiful.
Hope you're enjoying the show. Before you go away for the summer, this is to remind you that Material Matters London isn't far away. It runs from the 17th to the 20th of September at Space House, which is on the outskirts of Covent Garden, so it's super central. We have a plethora of amazing exhibitors joining us this year, ranging from major brands such as 3M and Akzo Nobel, manufacturers like ARPA, Tarkett and Domus Tiles, companies you might not know so much about, including Chinese fashion label Zugzag and mycelium innovator Myco Works. There are features from the likes of Priestman Good, the Wood Awards and the Only Natural Design Competition, and of course designers and makers who are confounding our expectations when it comes to materials. Look out for the likes of Jacob Marks, Sophie Boons, Michaela Pedros, Wedge and Revive Innovations, to name just a handful. And I haven't even mentioned the Talks programme yet. It's going to be great and it's free for trade, but you must register. For details, go to our website, materialmatters.design. That's materialmatters.design. Hope to see you there. As we said, there are a number of threads running through the book. The primary one is race. You make the point that Abloh's relationship with the fashion establishment was perhaps more nuanced than his friend Kanye West's. Partly that's because of his suburban educated background. He was born in Rockford, Illinois, as we said in the intro, to Ghanaian immigrant parents who had a strong work ethic. And you write that Abloh was the right kind of black man. Can we unpick that? What does that mean?
Well, it was significant to me that he was regularly referred to as the son of Ghanaian immigrants, as opposed to simply being referred to as African American, which was also correct. And, Virgil had talked about, visiting Ghana, seeing both the wealth and the poverty, knowing what his parents had given up in order to come to the States. And, once said he had no interest in studying engineering in college, but his parents wanted a son who was an engineer. And he felt, well, that's the least that I can do. I'll give them a son who's an engineer. I think when you have that sense of your history, when you have seen a country, a world in which both the most powerful and the poorest all look like you, it gives you this sense of the vastness of possibility, but it also gives you a kind of privilege. And I think that Virgil was able to really move through his professional life with the sense of privilege that white men in America are able to move through their day, which is not this self-conscious sense of being the only one in the room, or what does it mean, what does it represent that I'm doing X, Y, and Z, or am I not getting this opportunity because of my ethnicity or race? I mean, without all of those sort of complicated historical burdens that exist for those Black Americans whose ancestry goes back to enslavement. And, it's a complicated thing. It's a nuanced thing. But I do think that it's that sense of privilege and that sense of belonging in any room that you want to enter is very powerful. And it allows you a kind of freedom of dreaming that is really valuable. And that was certainly very valuable for Virgil.
You talk about him having, and I'm going to quote, an optimistic attitude on the subject of race. How did that manifest itself?
Well, he would say things like, I'm not a rebel. I'm not a flamethrower. He, only half jokingly said, let's make corporate culture cool. This was not someone who wanted to turn over the tables, and, he wanted to have the seat at the head of the table. And I think he also, because he spent so much time alongside Kanye West, who he worked for and with, he saw he saw the more difficult route that Kanye had, because he felt that all slights, that all sense, that any sort of disrespect needed to be addressed. And for Virgil, I don't think they went unnoticed, but I think he just sort of had this sense of, one, I can't be perceived as the cliche angry Black man. And also that, he wanted to keep his eye on the goal and not let these other things distract him.
There was a moment that you mentioned in the book where this ability to navigate between communities came slightly a cropper during the Black Lives Matter moment. There was a moment of backlash against his, I guess, optimistic attitude, as you described it.
Yeah, I would say it was a backlash against his centrism. It was really the first time that Twitter, social media, kind of turned against him. And it was because in that moment, the idea of nuance was not particularly appreciated. There was definitely this sense of, either or. And Virgil, this sort of bubbled up because Virgil had posted something in which he reprimanded looters. And, the way that it was taken on social media was that he was valuing things over people. And it was a moment when that was quite jarring. And, a friend of his said that it was a moment when he sort of recognized that this idea that on social media he was talking to his friends suddenly was punctured. And he realized that, all these people who are following me on social media, they're not my friends. Like there's no way that my community, so to speak, can be that expansive. And it was the first time that he sort of publicly just sort of mused about what he felt like as a dark-skinned Black man, in Chicago, moving through the day to day. And you sort of saw that even though these were things that he hadn't regularly and publicly talked about, and even though they were things that he never seemed to really let get in the way of his progress, he clearly saw them. He clearly felt them. And it was a moment when, for me as I was a reporter, I thought it is really heartbreaking that he didn't live longer, because I would love to have seen how he might have evolved after that. And if he would have been less of a centrist, if he would have become more of a flamethrower, I don't know.
I was going to ask whether that moment changed his attitude both to social media, but also his work.
It didn't seem to change the way that he engaged with social media, but I do think that the work after that point, particularly the work for Vuitton, became, the emotions became deeper. That first Vuitton show was quite bright and fuzzy and fizzy. It was the rainbow runway and allusions to the Wizard of Oz and, a band of friends reaching the Emerald City. And it was very fizzy. And the runway was lined with students from Paris fashion schools. I felt like after the Black Lives Matter protests began, and a lot of this was also happening during the pandemic, his work became more reflective of his background. It became a bit more considered about ethnicity and race. And I don't think it was any less optimistic, but it felt much weightier and more nuanced. Not quite as fizzy, but in many ways much more fulfilling.
Yeah. On this podcast, we talk about product design and architecture quite a lot. How important was his training in architecture? Did it feed directly into his clothes? I know Rem Koolhaas was an early influence.
Yeah. He said that he went to architecture school because it seemed like this bridge between sort of the engineering part of him and his desire for something that was more creative and would allow him to engage with aesthetics more. He'd taken this class on Renaissance painting, and that had been really inspiring for him his last year of college. And, he never intended to be an architect, though. And I think the way that it influenced him is it certainly gave him a language and a framework for being able to think about the kind of fashion that he wanted to do and the way that he engaged with fashion. And it was also, I think one of the reasons why his fashion could be so frustrating sometimes, because he was less interested in, as I say in the book, in the fit of a little black dress. and more interested in sort of the meaning of the dress and how someone might move through the world in that dress. And, when you're not thinking about the fit of the dress, I think you are using fashion as a way of communicating sort of big ideas about aesthetics and community and relationships. But I feel like you're not really mastering the language. And if you can master the language and take on all of those other aspects, then I think you're just that much more eloquent.
The book also charts, and we've alluded to some of this, but I'd like to talk about it further, also charts the changes in the fashion industry during his career that allowed a black man like Abloh to reach artistic director of a company like Louis Vuitton, when really his only formal training was a brief internship at Fendi, I think I'm right in saying. So what happened to the luxury fashion world? Why did it need a figure like Abloh?
Well, I don't know if it needed a figure like Abloh, but it was ready for a figure like Abloh. I don't think that he could have entered the fashion universe at that level had he been trying to do so through women's wear. Menswear was uniquely situated for that door to open, in part because menswear was a place where Black men, Latino men had really sort of risen to the roles of fashion icons and fashion leaders, thanks in no small part to the importance of athletes, musicians, actors, hip-hop artists, hip-hop entrepreneurs in shaping that world. And, the people who were on the covers of magazines were musicians and athletes, men's magazines, I should say. And so they really had an outsized impact and influence. And that made that industry, I think, much more comfortable with Virgil leading the way. And then you sort of add to it the fact that so much of menswear had really just been invigorated and was having huge influences on the rest of the fashion industry. The big sweeping changes in fashion were really sparked by menswear. Things like sneaker culture and the blurring of gender and the, athletic wear as just sort of sportswear, that all came from menswear. And, that allowed Virgil to sort of be seen as a viable option for a position like the one at Vuitton. And when you think about menswear, if you're not dealing in sort of tailored clothing, so much of menswear was really dominated by hoodies and track pants and T-shirts and sneakers. And while those take a certain amount of, technical skill, it's not the same kind of technical skill that would necessarily be required to produce a women's collection.
No, fair enough. There's a lovely quote that I picked out of the book, is that when you wrote, "When men fell for sneakers, fashion outsiders gained the upper hand in fashion," which I thought was a really nice way of putting it. The other thing I was intrigued by, which I knew nothing about and was really, really fascinated by, was the role of basketball and the NBA and the new rules that they brought in that changed men's fashion and the way that basketball players dressed. And I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that, because in England, maybe people do know about this, but I knew nothing about this at all. I thought it was really intriguing.
Yeah, it was a fascinating moment. The men's basketball had a problem with, or at least a perceived problem with a lot of its younger players who were very much into hip hop. And at this point, sort of like gangster rap was a big thing. And they adopted a lot of the gestures of that genre of music. The baggy pants and the head wraps and the jewelry and the tattoos and all of that. And then you had this overlay of like actual violence. There had been this terrible brawl at a game at the Palace of Auburn Hills in Michigan. And none of this, the NBA felt looked good for them. And if it didn't look good for them, that could play into the finances. And so they instituted this dress code. And the dress code was essentially that if a player was on NBA business, but not on the court, they needed to wear business attire. And it was quite specific in what was allowed and what was not. And the initial pushback was, wait, they're trying to essentially, censor our personal expression. But then a lot of those players sort of leaned into fashion, and the walk from the parking lot into the stadium became this runway, and designers were happy to oblige these players because they had great physiques for the clothing, and it became a kind of competition. Players realized that by using fashion, they could create a personality and for themselves that was blasted far beyond the world of sports. Some of them thought about starting their own lines and so on and so on. And because that happened, it really injected menswear with these athletes of incredible reputation and reach. And it really changed the way that menswear and athletes and Black men and men in general thought about fashion. Because instead of fashion having to rely on, some model to, pose on the cover of a magazine and entice a guy in Chicago to spend a lot of money on something, they could have, Russell Westbrook on the cover of a magazine looking incredibly dapper in edgy fashion. And that's a much better lure for most men to consider fashion than a model whose name they don't know.
Of all the garments, it seems that T-shirts were hugely important. Well, not only to Abloh's career, but to this era of fashion in general. What is it about the T-shirt?
Well, it's a blank canvas, right? And first of all, it doesn't require a great deal of technical skill to produce a T-shirt. And frankly, you don't even have to produce the T-shirt. You can just buy stock T-shirt and then you can silkscreen it with your brand, with your logo, with your design. And it's a way of communicating. I mean, it has been for decades. It's a way of being able to communicate with a community of people and say, hey, I see you, you see me, we're engaged and we love the same things. And, it was also, again, sort of being in the right place at the right time. Givenchy had this huge hit with a T-shirt that had a picture of a Rottweiler on it. And it was in one of the shows, it was worn by the right people, and suddenly this designer T-shirt that I believe was sold for about $700 became a thing. And if you can hit with the right thing printed on a T-shirt, suddenly young people thought, wait, I can have a fashion line.
Yeah, it becomes a DIY way of entering the fashion industry. I'm also interested by the history. You chart the designers that came before Virgil, particularly Edward Buchanan and Oswald Boateng, who emerged as Abloh was leaving high school. How did they pave the way for him?
Well, for both of them, they, just sort of made it possible to imagine someone of Virgil's background, a Black man in that kind of role at one of these European legacy fashion houses. Edward was significant because, he came along so early, and he was able to he was an example for me of the way that the industry's reliance on something like social media had become quite profound, and the way that fashion had broken out of a bubble. When Edward started, most people in fashion knew he was there at Bottega Veneta, but no one outside of fashion did. I mean, it just, and that's no, it says nothing about Bottega or about Edward. It was just, that was not something that people outside the industry were looking at. And with Oswald, he was really instructive for me in trying to understand Virgil's rise, because so many of the things that they shared a lot in common. They had a similar background as children of immigrants, but they dealt with race in a very different way. Oswald talked about how for a long time he sort of dodged being photographed because, as he said, even though he has a distinctly African last name, when people listened to what he was talking about when it came to fashion, when they listened to him talking about Savile Row and bespoke suiting and, sort of British traditions, they didn't equate that with a Black person. And he wanted his work to not be caught up in issues of race. And, I thought it was so interesting that was the way that he sort of chose to navigate when he became the head of menswear for Givenchy. And it was very different from the way that Virgil approached things when he arrived at Vuitton. And it was also striking to me because both Givenchy and Vuitton are owned by the same luxury conglomerate. And so it was striking that there had been this sort of history-making appointment all those years before Virgil, some 15 years before Virgil.
So would Virgil have been able to achieve what he achieved without them?
That's a good question. I am inclined to say no, because I think that, everyone's success comes along because of, paths that have been cleared, because of truths that have been proven, because of assumptions that have been tested. And I think both of those men tested assumptions and helped to clear a path.
I mean, the other character that features prominently in the book and who we've already mentioned is producer and rapper Kanye West. They originally met in Chicago. Abloh was part of his inner circle, then left his shadow and emerged as a designer in his own right. As we pointed out, Kanye had a troubled relationship with the fashion establishment. Abloh was able to play the game rather more adroitly. The pair were friends, but there was perhaps a slight tinge of jealousy. How would you characterize that relationship? Because it is central to your book.
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, Kanye, I remember one of his early shows for Yeezy, and it was a solid presentation. And then at a certain point, Kanye comes out, takes his bow, and then takes the microphone and delivers this soliloquy about how the fashion industry is afraid of taking a risk, refuses to be creative, and he was there to save the industry. as you can imagine,
Yeah, I can.
that did not go over well. But that said, during this particular period, Kanye was also in a position of having the financial ability and the contacts to really be wildly ambitious and adventurous and to sweep up other people in that cyclone of ambition and possibility. And Virgil was swept up in that cyclone. And I think that's a gift. That's an incredible gift to have a contemporary, someone that you can sit and talk to at length about art and style and design and be taken seriously. And then have the possibility of them doing something about it. That window of Kanye's life, I think, was really quite amazing and admirable. Just the ambition that he was able to inspire.
I mean, Kanye was obviously one influence, but there are some fascinating influences and names that crop up. I was not expecting to read Peter Savile's name in your book. That came as quite a shock. Can we talk about, just really quickly about their relationship, how they met?
Well, as with so many things, it began with Kanye. Peter said that he kept having people say to him, "Oh, have you met Virgil yet?" And he hadn't. And then finally, he did meet Virgil, and Virgil referred to him as a mentor. And Peter sort of pushed back on that and said, I can't imagine why he would say that. But Virgil sort of, whoever he admired, if someone's work inspired him, he sort of considered them a mentor. And he was inspired by Peter's graphic design work, by the album covers, by his understanding and his playfulness with irony, by the Hacienda nightclub. All of these things. And Virgil was really excited and into sort of European pop and techno, which came from Detroit but had a huge following in Europe. So that's really what engaged him. Virgil was such a graphic design person, and Peter sort of embodied all of the different things that Virgil sort of thought was cool and interesting and challenging about design, graphic design.
And I suppose Savile has that same magpie-like ability to pinch stuff and give it a new meaning, which is kind of interesting. Well, he launched his label Off-White, and then he took the post at Vuitton. Why was Vuitton the right fit for Virgil?
Because Vuitton's not really a fashion label. It's really a label that sees itself as sort of a cultural, magpie. I'll use your word. It's really about culture, and it likes to align itself with artists and musicians, and that was right for Virgil because he wasn't, a technically trained designer, but he understood culture. He understood what was exciting and what was attractive to people and what kept them engaged.
As we know, Robin, he very sadly died of cancer, a rare form of cancer at the age of 41. What do you feel his legacy is? I was really interested. You closed the book by writing about Pharrell Williams, his successor at Vuitton. And as a reader, you get the distinct sense you weren't that impressed by the appointment.
I wasn't. I was disappointed because I felt that Vuitton took sort of the wrong lesson from Virgil's success. Virgil was successful because he brought this sense of community to the work and to the idea of luxury. And, not because he just had this massive array of fans who he could sort of bring to the party. And I think the message that Vuitton took was, oh, look how many followers he has. I think Virgil's lasting impact is this idea that luxury is what you value. And, the things that get elevated, the things that are considered, something that should be preserved, are only such things because of who's been writing the narratives, who's been putting, the wall verbiage up at museums. And, to underscore that there are a lot of different viewpoints about luxury, I think is a really important one. And, his fans were not people who had a problem with designer fashion, who had a problem with these big logo houses. They loved them. They wanted to engage with them, but they wanted to engage with them in a way that felt meaningful.
Before you started writing about him, did you have preconceptions? And I wonder if those have changed during the course of writing the book.
Preconceptions about...
Well, him, his work, his position in the fashion firmament.
Well, I certainly had preconceptions about the quality of the work, the originality of the work. And, in reporting the book, my sense of the originality didn't change. But my sense of why it was meaningful to his fans became... I got a much better sense of why it was meaningful for them. And I think I also walked away with just an incredible amount of respect for someone who, fundamentally said, I choose optimism. And, that can sound a bit Pollyanna-ish, but,
no, I like it.
It's also a pretty powerful thing to say. Not that you're going to be dismissive of the problems and the hurdles, but you're going to choose to believe that they can be dealt with.
Very nice. And has writing the book changed your view of the fashion industry itself?
I wouldn't say that it's changed my view, but it has reminded me that fashion does have the capacity for change, for progress, for expanding for opening its doors and expanding the aperture and who gets to be seen. Sometimes because the industry, as quickly as it opens a door, can shut it, it's nice to be reminded that, the industry still knows how to open those doors. The industry still knows how to look widely and to savor a moment when looking widely proves to have been incredibly beneficial. And I just sort of hope that the industry reminds itself of that.
Very good. Well, that's a lovely, optimistic way to end this interview. Robin, congratulations on the book. I thoroughly enjoyed it even. I implore everybody to go out and buy it and read it on the beach in the summer. It's a great read. Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you so much.
Make It Ours, Crashing the Gates of Culture with Virgil Abloh by Robin Givhan is out now. And the good news is you can purchase it directly from us. We are about to open a brand new virtual bookshop, which we're just putting the final touches to at the moment. It will have books from loads of the guests we've had on the show. However, for now, I'll put a link in the blurb for this episode and you're incredibly welcome to buy it from there. It's a great read. You can also go to our website, materialmatters.design, to hear other podcasts I've done and to sign up to our newsletter and to find out all about Material Matters London, which runs from the 17th to the 20th of September at Space House. For all the latest news and to see who's exhibiting, you can also go to our Instagram page, which is materialmatters.design. One more thing, it would make me incredibly happy if you went to my Patreon page and made a pledge at patreon.com/Material Matters. For as little as £3.50 a month, you can receive invites to various Material Matters events, as well as getting access to each episode before it's published to the wider world. Material Matters is a completely independent concern, and any help you can offer would be hugely appreciated. Ultimately, you'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft, and design to a whole new audience. Thanks very much for listening.